The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. Read by Derek Jacobi. The mole had been working very hard all morning, spring cleaning his little home, first with brooms, then with dusters, then with a brush and a pail of whitewash, till he had dust in his eyes, splashes of whitewash all over his black fur, an aching back and weary arms. It was small wonder that he suddenly flung down his brush, said, "Bother!" and "Hang spring cleaning!" and bolted out of the house. He made for a steep little tunnel, and he scratched and scrabbled with his paws, muttering, "Up we go!" till at last, pop! His snout came out into the sunlight, and he found himself rolling in a great meadow. "This is fine," he said. "This is better than whitewashing." The sunshine struck hot on his fur, soft breezes caressed his brow, and the carol of birds fell on his dulled hearing like a shout. Jumping off all his four legs at once, in the delight of spring without its cleaning, he pursued his way across the meadow till he reached the edge of a full-fed river. Never in his life had he seen a river before. All was a shake and shiver, glints and gleams and sparkles, rustle and swirl and bubble. Mole was bewitched. He sat on the bank while the river chattered on to him. A dark hole in the bank opposite caught his eye. Something bright seemed to twinkle down in the heart of it like a tiny star. Then it winked at him, and so declared itself to be an eye. A small face began to grow up round it, a brown little face with whiskers, neat ears, and silky hair. It was the water rat. "Hello, Mole," said the water rat. "Hello, Rat," said the mole. "Would you like to come over?" The rat stepped into a little boat and sculled smartly across. Mole stepped gingerly down, and to his rapture found himself seated in the stern of a real boat. "I've never been in a boat before in all my life," said he, as the rat took to the sculls again. "What?" cried the rat, open-mouthed. "Never? Well, Is it as nice as all that?" asked the mole shyly. "Nice? It's the only thing," said the water rat solemnly. "There is nothing half so much worth doing as messing about in boats. Look here. If you've nothing else on hand this morning, supposing we drop down the river together and have a long day of it." The mole waggled his toes from happiness. "Let us start at once." "Hold hard a minute, then." The rat looped the painter through a ring in his landing stage, climbed up into his hole, and reappeared, staggering under a fat wicker luncheon basket. "Shove that under your feet." He passed it down, untied the painter, and took the sculls again. "What's inside?" asked the mole. "Cold chicken," replied the rat. "Cold tongue, cold ham, cold beef, pickled gherkin, salad, French rolls, cress sandwiches, potted meat, ginger beer, lemonade, soda water." "Oh, stop, stop!" cried the mole in ecstasies. Intoxicated with the sparkle, the scents, the sounds, and the sunlight, he trailed a paw in the water and dreamed. The water rat sculled steadily on, and forbore to disturb him. "So, this is a river?" said the mole. "The river," corrected the rat. "And you really live by the river?" "By it, and with it, and in it, and on it," said the rat. "What lies over there?" asked the mole, waving a paw towards woodland on one side of the river. "The wild wood," said the rat shortly. "We don't go there much, we river-bankers." "Aren't they very nice in there?" said the mole nervously. "Well, the squirrels are all right, and the rabbits, some of them. And Badger, of course, he lives right in the heart of it. Dear old Badger. Nobody interferes with him. Why? Who should? Well, there are others. Weasels, stoats, foxes, and so on. They're all right in a way, past the time of day when we meet and all that, but, well, you can't really trust them. Now then, here's our backwater at last, where we are going to lunch. The Rat brought the boat alongside the bank, made her fast, helped Mole ashore, and swung out the luncheon basket. The Mole spread out the tablecloth, took out the packets and arranged them, gasping, "Oh, my! Oh, my!" at every fresh revelation. When all was ready, the Rat said, "Now, pitch in, old fellow." The Mole was glad to obey. "What are you looking at?" said the Rat presently. "A streak of bubbles, travelling along the surface of the water." "Bubbles? Oh-ho!" said the Rat, and chirruped in an inviting sort of way. A glistening muzzle showed above the edge of the bank, and the Otter hauled himself out and shook the water from his coat. "Greedy beggars! Why didn't you invite me, Ratty?" "This was an impromptu affair," explained the Rat. By the way, my friend Mr. Mole." "Proud, I'm sure," said the Otter. "Well, tell us who's out on the river," said the Rat. "Toad, for one," replied the Otter, "and his brand-new boat. New togs, new everything." The two animals laughed. "Once it was nothing but sailing," said the Rat. "Then he took to punting. Last year it was houseboating. It's the same. Whatever he takes up, he gets tired of it and starts on something fresh." "A good fellow," remarked the Otter, "but no stability." An errant mayfly swerved athwart the current. A swirl of water and a cloop, and the mayfly was visible no more. Neither was the Otter. But again there was a streak of bubbles on the surface of the river. "Well, well," said the Rat, "I suppose we ought to be moving." The afternoon sun was low, as the Rat sculled gently homewards. Presently the Mole, already quite at home in a boat, so he thought, said, "Ratty, please, I want to row now." The Rat shook his head. "Not yet, my friend. Wait till you've had a few lessons. It's not so easy as it looks. Look here, I think you had better come and stop with me for a little time. I'll teach you to row and to swim, and you'll soon be as handy on the water as the rest of us." The Mole was so touched that he could find no voice to answer him. When they got home, the Rat made a bright fire in the parlour and planted the Mole in an armchair in front of it, and told him river stories till supper-time. Supper was a most cheerful meal. Shortly afterwards, a sleepy Mole was escorted by his host to the best bedroom, where he laid his head on his pillow in great peace and contentment, his new-found friend, the river, lapping the sill of his window. "Ratty," said Mole one bright summer morning, "won't you take me to call on Mr. Toad? I've heard so much about him." "Certainly," said the good-natured Rat. "Get the boat out and we'll paddle up there at once. It's never the wrong time to call on Toad. He's always glad to see you." "He must be a very nice animal," observed the Mole, as he got into the boat. "He is, indeed," replied Rat. "Simple, good-natured, and affectionate. Perhaps he's not very clever, and it may be that he's boastful and conceited, but he's got some great qualities, has Toady." Rounding a bend in the river, they came in sight of a handsome house of mellowed brick, with well-kept lawns reaching down to the water's edge. "Toad Hall," said Rat. "One of the nicest houses in these parts." They glided up a creek and passed into the shadow of a large boathouse. They disembarked and strolled across the lawns in search of Toad, whom they happened upon resting in a wicker garden chair, a map on his knees. "Hooray!" he cried, jumping up on seeing them, never waiting for an introduction to Mole. "You don't know how lucky it is you're turning up just now. Come with me, dear Ratty, and your friend, and you shall see what you shall see." He led the way to the stable-yard, and there they saw a gypsy caravan, painted a canary yellow. "There!" cried the Toad. "There's real life for you! The open road, travel, interest, excitement! Come inside and look at the arrangements." The Mole followed him eagerly up the steps. The Rat snorted and remained where he was. It was indeed very compact and comfortable. Sleeping bunks, a cooking stove, lockers, bookshelves, pots, pans, and kettles. "All complete," said the Toad, as they descended the steps again. "You'll find that nothing's been forgotten when we make our start this afternoon." "I beg your pardon?" said the Rat. "Did you say we, and start, and this afternoon?" "Now, dear Ratty," said Toad imploringly, "you've got to come. I can't possibly manage without you. Oh, come and have some lunch and we'll talk it over." During luncheon, the Toad painted the prospects of the trip and the joys of the open life in such glowing colours that the Mole could hardly sit in his chair for excitement. The Rat allowed his good nature to override his personal objections. He could not bear to disappoint his friends, already deep in schemes and anticipations. When they were quite ready, the Toad led his companions to the paddock. The old grey horse was caught and harnessed, and they set off. It was a golden afternoon. The smell of the dust they kicked up was rich and satisfying. Birds whistled cheerily. Wayfarers stopped to say nice things about their beautiful cart. Late in the evening, tired and happy, they drew up on a remote common, turned the horse loose to graze, and ate their supper sitting on the grass. At last they turned into their little bunks in the cart, and Toad said, "Well, good night, you fellows. This is the real life for a gentleman. Talk about your old river." They had a pleasant ramble next day, and it was not until the afternoon that disaster sprang out on them. They were strolling along the high road when, far behind them, they heard a hum, like the drone of a distant bee. Glancing back, they saw a cloud of dust advancing on them at an incredible speed, while a faint boop, boop wailed like an animal in pain. In an instant, with a blast of wind and a whirl of sound, it was on them. The poop, poop rang with a brazen shout, and the magnificent motor-car flung a cloud of dust that enwrapped them utterly, and then dwindled to a speck in the distance, a droning bee once more. Rearing and plunging, the horse drove the cart backwards towards the ditch at the side of the road. There was a crash, and the cart lay on its side, an irredeemable wreck. The Rat danced up and down in the road. "Villains!" he shouted. "Scoundrels! Road hogs!" The Mole was trying to quiet the horse. Then he went to look at the cart. It was a sorry sight. Panels and windows smashed, axles bent, sardine tins scattered over the wide world. The Rat came to help, but their united efforts were not sufficient to right the cart. "Hi, Toad!" they cried. "Come and bear a hand, can't you?" The Toad never answered, so they went to see what was the matter. They found him seated in the road, in a trance, a happy smile on his face. The Rat shook him by the shoulder. "Toad? Glorious, stirring sight," murmured Toad. "The real way to travel, the only way to travel. Oh, bliss! Oh, poop, poop! And to think I never knew, never even dreamt." "What are we to do with him?" asked the Mole. "Nothing," replied the Rat firmly. "There's nothing to be done. I know him of old. He's possessed. He has got a new craze, and he'll continue like that for days now, in a dream quite useless for all practical purposes." The rat knotted the horse's reins over his back and took him by the head. "Come on," he said grimly to the mole. "It's 5 or 6 miles to the nearest town. The sooner we make a start, the better." There was a pattering of feet behind them, and Toad caught them up and thrust a paw inside the elbow of each of them. "Oh, Ratty, you can't think how obliged I am to you for consenting to come on this trip. I wouldn't have gone without you, and then I might never have seen that sunbeam, that thunderbolt. I might never have heard that entrancing sound or smelt that bewitching smell. I owe it to you, my best of friends." "You see," the rat said to the mole, "quite hopeless. I give up." Eventually, a train having landed them at a station not far from Toad Hall, they escorted the spellbound Toad to his door, got their boat from the boathouse, sculled down the river, and at a very late hour sat down to supper in their own cosy riverside parlour. The following evening, the mole was fishing on the bank, when the rat came strolling along to find him. "You heard the news?" he said. "Toad went up to town by an early train this morning, and he has ordered a large and very expensive motor car." The mole wanted to make the acquaintance of the badger. He seemed to be an important personage, but whenever the mole mentioned his wish to the water rat, he always found himself put off. "It's all right," the rat would say. "Badger will turn up some day, and then I'll introduce you." "Supposing we go and call on him," suggested the mole. "Oh, he wouldn't like that at all," said the rat, quite alarmed. "Besides, it's out of the question. He lives in the very middle of the wild wood." "Well, you told me the wild wood was all right, you know." "So it is," replied the rat evasively. "But it's a long way, and he wouldn't be at home at this time of year anyhow. He'll be coming along some day if you'll wait quietly." The mole had to be content with this. In the winter-time the rat slept a great deal, retiring early and rising late, and the mole had a good deal of spare time on his hands. So, one afternoon, when the rat was dozing in his armchair before the fire, he resolved to go out and explore the wild wood, and perhaps strike up an acquaintance with Mr. Badger. It was a cold afternoon, with a steely sky overhead, when he slipped out. The wild wood lay before him, low and threatening. There was nothing to alarm him at first entry. Twigs crackled under his feet. Logs tripped him. He penetrated to where the light was less. Trees crouched nearer and nearer, and holes made ugly mouths at him on either side. Everything was very still. The dusk advanced rapidly, gathering behind and before. Over his shoulder he thought he saw an evil little face, looking out at him from a hole. When he turned, the thing had vanished. He quickened his pace. Past another hole, and a narrow face with hard eyes flashed up for an instant, and was gone. Suddenly, every hole, far and near, seemed to possess its face, all fixing on him glances of malice and hatred. Then the whistling began, faint and shrill, and far behind him. Then it sounded far ahead of him. It broke out on either side and seemed to be passed on throughout the whole length of the wood. And the pattering began, the pat, pat, pat of little feet. Was it in front or behind? It grew and multiplied, till from every quarter it seemed to be closing in on him. The whole wood seemed running now, hunting, chasing, closing in. In panic, Mole began to run too. At last he took refuge in the deep hollow of a beech tree, and as he lay there, panting and trembling and listening to the whistlings and patterings outside, he knew in all its fullness that dread thing which the rat had tried to shield him from, the terror of the wild wood. Meantime, the rat dozed by his fireside. A coal slipped, and he woke with a start, and looked round for the mole, but the mole was not there. He called, "Moley!" several times, and receiving no answer, got up and went out into the hall. The mole's cap was missing from its peg. His goloshes were also gone. The rat left the house and carefully examined the muddy ground, hoping to find the mole's tracks. There they were, running straight towards the wild wood. The rat re-entered the house, took up a stout cudgel, and set off for the wild wood. It was getting towards dusk as he plunged without hesitation into the wood, calling out cheerfully, "Moley! Moley, where are you?" "It's me, Rat." He had hunted for an hour or more, when, at last, to his joy, he heard an answering cry. He made his way to the foot of an old beech tree with a hole in it. From out of the hole came a feeble voice. "Ratty, is that really you?" The rat crept into the hollow and found the mole trembling. "Oh, Rat," he exclaimed, "I've been so frightened." "I quite understand," said the rat soothingly. "You shouldn't have done it, Mole. I did my best to keep you from it. We riverbankers hardly ever come here by ourselves. Now we must start for home. It will never do to spend the night here. Too cold, for one thing." He went to the entrance of the retreat and put his head out. "Hello! Here is a go! It's snowing hard." Looking out, the mole saw that hollows, pools, and pitfalls were vanishing fast. A fine powder filled the air. Well, it can't be helped," said the rat. "The worst of it is, I don't exactly know where we are. This snow makes everything look so very different." It did indeed. However, they set out bravely and took the line that seemed most promising. An hour or two later, they were aching with fatigue, bruised with tumbles, and wet through. The snow was getting so deep they could hardly drag their legs through it. There seemed to be no end to this wood, and no beginning, and worst of all, no way out. Suddenly, the mole tripped and fell on his face with a squeal. "Oh, my shin!" He sat up and nursed his leg in both front paws. "Oh, poor old mole," said the rat kindly. "Let's have a look. Oh, yes, you've cut your shin, sure enough." "I must have tripped over a stump," said the mole miserably. "It's a very clean cut," said the rat, examining it. "Looks as if it was made by a sharp metal edge. Funny." He pondered, and then began scraping busily in the snow. Suddenly the rat cried, "Hooray!" and fell to executing a jig. "Come and see." The mole hobbled up and had a look. "A door scraper? Why dance jigs round a door scraper?" The rat set to work again, and after further toil, a shabby doormat lay exposed to view. "There!" exclaimed the rat in triumph. "Now, Mole, dig and hunt around if you want to sleep dry and warm tonight." The rat attacked a snowbank with his cudgel, and the mole scraped busily too. Some 10 minutes' hard work, and the cudgel struck something hollow. He called the mole to come and help him, and the two animals worked busily, till, at last, in full view, stood a little door. An iron bell pull hung by the side, and below, on a brass plate, they could read Mr. Badger. The mole sprang up at the bell pull and swung there, both feet off the ground. From a long way off, they could hear a deep-toned bell respond. At last they heard slow, shuffling footsteps approaching. A bolt shot back, and the door opened enough to show a long snout and a pair of sleepy eyes.
"Who is it?"
said a gruff voice.
"Disturbing people on such a night."
"Oh, Badger!" cried the rat. "Let us in, please. It's me, Rat, and my friend Mole. We've lost our way in the snow."
"Ratty!"
exclaimed the Badger in quite a different voice.
"Come along in, both of you. You must be perished. The wild wood at this time of night."
The two animals tumbled over each other in their eagerness to get inside. The Badger looked kindly down on them and patted their heads.
"Come into the kitchen. There's a first-rate fire and supper and everything."
They followed him down a long passage. The Badger flung open a door, and they found themselves in the glow and warmth of a large kitchen. The Badger thrust them down on a settle to toast themselves at the fire, fetched them dressing-gowns and slippers, bathed the mole's shin, and mended the cut with sticking plaster. When they were thoroughly toasted, the Badger summoned them to the table, where he had been laying a repast. The Badger sat in his armchair and nodded as the animals told their story, and he did not seem surprised or shocked at anything. The mole began to feel very friendly toward him. When supper was finished at last, they gathered round the embers of the fire, and the Badger said heartily, "Now then, tell us the news from your part of the world. How's old Toad going on?"
"Oh, from bad to worse," said the rat gravely. "Another smash-up last week."
"How many has he had?" inquired the Badger gloomily.
"This is the 7th.
"He's been in hospital 3 times, put in the mole. "And as for the fines he's had to pay, it's awful to think of." "He's a hopelessly bad driver, regardless of law and order," continued the rat. "Badger, we're his friends. Oughtn't we to do something?" The Badger thought hard.
"Now, look here,"
he said at last.
"You know I can't do anything now."
His two friends assented. No animal is ever expected to do anything heroic during the off-season of winter.
"But once the year has turned and the nights are shorter and one's wanting to be up and doing by sunrise, well,
then we'll take the Toad seriously in hand.
We'll bring him back to reason, by force if need be. We'll make him a sensible Toad. We'll—"
"You're asleep, Rat."
"Not me,"
said the rat, waking up with a jerk. "He's been asleep 3 times since supper," laughed the mole.
"Well, it's time we were all in bed. Come along, and I'll show you to your quarters, and
take your time tomorrow morning. Breakfast at any hour you please." The 2 tired animals came down to breakfast very late next morning. The rat was anxious to be off, so the Badger, taking up his lantern, led the way along a damp tunnel that wound for miles. At last, daylight began to show through the tangled growth overhanging the mouth of the passage. The Badger, bidding them a hasty good-bye, pushed them through the opening and retreated. They found themselves on the very edge of the wild wood, and made swiftly for home. It was a bright morning in the early summer. The mole and the water rat were finishing breakfast in their little parlour, when a heavy knock sounded at the door. The mole went to attend the summons, and announced with much importance, "Mr. Badger." The Badger strode heavily into the room.
"The hour has come,"
he said with great solemnity. "What hour?" asked the rat uneasily, glancing at the clock on the mantelpiece.
"Why, Toad's hour," The hour of Toad. I said I would take him in hand as soon as the winter was well over. I'm going to take him in hand today."
"Hooray!" cried the Mole. "We'll teach him to be a sensible Toad."
"This very morning," continued the Badger, taking an armchair, "another new motor car will arrive at Toad Hall. You two will accompany me instantly to Toad Hall, and the rescue shall be accomplished."
"Right you are!" cried the Rat.
They set off on their mission of mercy, and reached Toad Hall to find a shiny new motor car, painted bright red, standing in front of the house. As they neared the door, it was flung open, and Mr. Toad, arrayed in goggles, cap, and overcoat, came swaggering down the steps, drawing on his gloves. "Hello!" he cried cheerfully. "You're just in time to come with me for a jolly... He noticed the stern look on the countenances of his friends, and his invitation remained unfinished. "Take him inside," said the Badger to his companions. Toad was hustled through the door, struggling and protesting. Badger turned to the chauffeur in charge of the motor car. "I'm afraid you won't be wanted today. Mr. Toad will not require the car. You needn't wait." Then he followed the others inside and shut the door. "Now then," he said to the Toad, "take those ridiculous things off." "Shan't," replied Toad, with great spirit. "Take them off him, then, you two," ordered the Badger. They had to lay Toad out on the floor, kicking and calling all sorts of names. The Rat sat on him, and the Mole got his motor clothes off him, and they stood him up again. A good deal of his blustering spirit seemed to have evaporated. He giggled, and looked from one to the other appealingly. "Toad," said the Badger severely, "you've disregarded all the warnings we've given you. You're getting us animals a bad name by your furious driving and your smashes, and your rows with the police. Now, I'll make one more effort to bring you to reason. You will come with me into the smoking room and hear some facts about yourself, and we'll see whether you come out of that room the same Toad that you went in." He took Toad into the smoking room and closed the door. "That's no good," said the Rat contemptuously. "Talking to Toad'll never cure him. He'll say anything." They made themselves comfortable in armchairs and waited. After 3/4 of an hour, the door opened, and the Badger reappeared, leading by the paw a very limp and dejected Toad. "My friends," said the Badger, "Toad has at last seen the error of his ways. He is truly sorry, and has undertaken to give up motor cars for ever. I have his solemn promise to that effect. Toad, I want you to repeat what you admitted in the smoking room just now. You are sorry for what you've done, and you see the folly of it all." There was a long pause. "No," Toad said stoutly. "I'm not sorry, and it wasn't folly. It was glorious." "What?" cried the Badger, scandalized. "Didn't you tell me in there?" "Oh, yes, in there," said Toad impatiently. "I'd have said anything in there. You're so eloquent, dear Badger, and put your points so frightfully well. But I've been going over things in my mind since, and I find that I'm not a bit sorry, really, so it's no good saying I am, now is it? On the contrary, I promise that the very first motor car I see, poop, poop, off I go in it." "Told you so," observed the Rat to the Mole. "Very well," said the Badger. "Since you won't yield to persuasion, we'll try what force can do. Take him upstairs, you two, and lock him in his bedroom." "It's for your own good, Toady," said the Rat kindly, as Toad, kicking and struggling, was hauled up the stairs. "We'll take care of everything for you till you're well, Toad," said the Mole, as they thrust him into his bedroom and turned the key. The three friends met in conference on the situation. "It's going to be a tedious business," sighed the Badger. "I've never seen Toad so determined. He must never be left unguarded. We shall have to take it in turns to be with him. till the poison has worked itself out of his system."
They arranged watches accordingly. Each animal took turns to sleep in Toad's room at night, and they divided the day up between them. One morning, the rat, whose turn it was to go on duty, went upstairs to relieve Badger, whom he found fidgeting to be off and stretch his legs in a ramble round his wood.
"Toad's still in bed,"
Badger told the rat outside the door.
"Can't get much out of him, except, 'Oh, leave him alone, he wants nothing, he'll be better presently,' and so on. Now, look out, Rat. When Toad's quiet and submissive, he's at his artfullest. There's sure to be something up. Well, now, I must be off."
"How are you today, old chap?" inquired the rat cheerfully as he approached Toad's bedside. A feeble voice replied, "Oh, thank you so much, dear Ratty. So good of you to inquire, but do not trouble about me. I'm a nuisance, I know."
"You are indeed," said the rat. "But I'd take any trouble on earth for you,
if only you'd be sensible."
"If I thought that, Ratty," murmured Toad, "then I would beg you, for the last time, probably, to step round to the village and fetch the doctor."
"Why, what do you want a doctor for?" inquired the rat, coming closer and examining him. He certainly lay very still, and his voice was weaker and his manner much changed.
"Surely you must have noticed of late," murmured Toad. "But no, why should you? Never mind."
"Look here, old man," said the rat, alarmed. "Of course I'll fetch a doctor if you really think you want him."
And while you're about it, would you mind asking the lawyer to step up?"
"A lawyer? Oh, he must be really bad," Rat said to himself, as he hurried from the room, not forgetting, however, to lock the door carefully behind him, and he ran off to the village on his errand of mercy. The Toad hopped lightly out of bed as soon as he heard the key turned. Then, laughing heartily, he dressed in the smartest suit he could lay hands on, filled his pockets with cash from a drawer in the dressing-table, and knotting the sheets from his bed together and tying one end of the rope round the central mullion of the bedroom window, scrambled out, slid to the ground, and marched off, whistling. It was a gloomy luncheon for the rat when the badger and the mole returned, and he had to face them with his story. The badger's caustic remarks may be imagined.
"However, talking won't mend matters," he said. "He's got clear away, and the worst of it is he'll be so conceited with his cleverness that he may commit any folly. We'd better sleep at Toad Hall for a while longer. Toad may be brought back at any moment, on a stretcher, or between two policemen."
Meanwhile, Toad was walking briskly along the high road, the sun smiling brightly on him, and all nature joining in a chorus of approval to the song of self-praise that his own heart was singing to him.
"Smart work, that," he chuckled. "Poor old Ratty! Won't he catch it when the badger gets back?"
He reached a town, marched into an inn, ordered the best luncheon that could be provided, and sat down to eat in the coffee-room. He was halfway through the meal when a familiar sound approaching down the street made him start. The poop, poop drew nearer. The car could be heard to turn into the inn yard and come to a stop, and presently the party entered the coffee-room, hungry, talkative, and gay. Toad slipped out quietly, paid his bill, and sauntered outside. The car stood in the middle of the yard, quite unattended. Toad walked slowly round it, musing deeply. "I wonder," he said to himself, if this sort of car starts easily.
Next moment he had hold of the handle and was turning it. As the familiar sound broke forth, the old passion seized on Toad and mastered him body and soul. He found himself seated in the driver's seat, pulled the lever, and swung the car out through the archway. As the car devoured the street and leapt forth on the high road through the open country, he was Toad once more. Toad the terror, the traffic queller, before whom all must give way. He chanted as he flew, and the miles were eaten up under him as he sped, he knew not whither, living his hour, reckless of what might come to him. The incorrigible rogue, whom we see cowering in the dock before us, observed the chairman of the bench of magistrates, has been found guilty, first, of stealing a valuable motor car, secondly, of driving to the public danger, and, thirdly, of gross impertinence to the rural police. Mr. Clerk, what is the severest penalty we can impose for these offences? The clerk scratched his nose with his pen.
Suppose you were to say 12 months for the theft, and 3 years for the furious driving, and 15 years for the cheek, which was pretty bad, judging by what we've heard from the witness box. Those figures tot up to 19 years.
First rate, said the chairman.
So you had better make it around 20 and be on the safe side,
concluded the clerk. An excellent suggestion, approved the chairman. The brutal minions of the law fell on the hapless Toad, loaded him with chains, and dragged him from the courthouse, shrieking, praying, protesting, across the marketplace, under the frowning archway of the grim old castle, past guard-rooms full of grinning soldiery, up winding stairs, past the rack chamber and the thumbscrew room, till they reached the door of the grimmest dungeon that lay in the heart of the keep. The rusty key creaked in the lock, the great door clanged, and Toad was a helpless prisoner in the remotest dungeon of the stoutest castle in all of merry England. Toad flung himself at full length on the floor and abandoned himself to dark despair. This is the end of Toad, the popular and handsome Toad, the rich and hospitable Toad, the Toad so free and careless and debonair. O wise old badger, O clever rat and sensible mole, what sound judgments, what a knowledge of men and matters you possess! O unhappy and forsaken Toad! With lamentations such as these, he passed his days and nights for several weeks. Now, the jailer had a daughter, pleasant and good-hearted, who was particularly fond of animals. This kind girl, pitying the misery of Toad, went one day and knocked at the door of his cell. "Cheer up, Toad," she said coaxingly on entering. "Sit up and dry your eyes and be sensible." She carried a cup of tea and a plate piled with hot buttered toast. The smell talked to Toad of warm kitchens, of breakfasts on bright frosty mornings, of cosy parlour firesides on winter evenings. He sat up, dried his eyes, sipped his tea and munched his toast, and soon began talking freely about himself and his doings, how important he was, and what his friends thought of him. The topic was doing him as much good as the tea, and when she said good night, having filled his water jug and shaken up his straw for him, Toad was very much the same sanguine, self-satisfied animal that he had been of old.
He curled up in the straw and had an excellent night's rest, and the pleasantest of dreams. They had many interesting talks together after that, as the dreary days went on, and the gaoler's daughter grew very sorry for Toad, and thought it a shame that a poor animal should be locked up in prison for what seemed to her a very trivial offence. One morning the girl said thoughtfully, "Toad, I have an aunt who is a washerwoman. She does the washing for all the prisoners in this castle. Now, you're very rich, and she's very poor. A few pounds wouldn't make any difference to you, and it would mean a lot to her. I think you could come to some arrangement by which she would let you have her dress and bonnet, and you could escape from the castle. You're very alike, particularly about the figure." "We are not," said the Toad in a huff. "I have a very elegant figure for what I am." "Have it your own way, you horrid, proud, ungrateful animal." Honest Toad was always ready to admit himself in the wrong. "You are a good, kind, clever girl," he said, "and I am indeed a proud and stupid Toad. Introduce me to your worthy aunt, if you will be so kind." Next evening the girl ushered her aunt into Toad's cell. In return for his cash, Toad received a cotton gown, an apron, a shawl, and a rusty black bonnet. Shaking with laughter, the girl hooked him into the gown, arranged the shawl, and tied the strings of the bonnet under his chin. "Now, goodbye, Toad, and good luck." With a quaking heart, Toad set forth cautiously on what seemed to be a most hazardous undertaking. But the washerwoman's squat figure, in its familiar cotton print, seemed a passport for every barred door and grim gateway. At last he heard the wicket gate in the great outer door click behind him, and knew that he was free. Dizzy with success, he walked quickly towards the town, not knowing in the least what he should do next. His attention was caught by some red and green lights a little way off, and the sound of the puffing and snorting of engines fell on his ear. "Aha!" he thought. "A railway station, the thing I want most in the whole world at this moment." He made his way to the station, found that a train bound in the direction of his home was due to start in half an hour, and went to buy his ticket. He gave the name of the station nearest to Toad Hall, and put his fingers in search of money where his waistcoat pocket should have been, and found no pocket. To his horror, he recollected that he had left both coat and waistcoat behind in his cell, and with them his pocket-book, money, keys, and watch. Full of despair, he wandered blindly down the platform where the train was standing. It was hard to be within sight of safety, and to be balked by the want of a few shillings. Very soon his escape would be discovered. The hunt would be up. He would be caught and dragged back to prison. What was to be done? As he pondered, he found himself opposite the engine, which was being oiled by its driver. "Hello, mother," said the engine driver. "What's the trouble?" "Oh, sir," cried Toad, "I'm a poor washerwoman, and I've lost my money, and can't pay for a ticket, and I must get home tonight. Oh, dear, oh, dear." "Oh, that's bad," said the engine driver. "Kids waiting for you, I dare say." "Any amount of them," sobbed Toad. "Well," said the good engine driver, "I'll give you a ride on my engine. It's against company regulations, but we're not so particular in these out-of-the-way places." The Toad scrambled up into the cab of the engine. The guard waved his flag, the engine driver whistled in cheerful response, and the train moved out of the station. They had covered many a mile when Toad noticed that the engine driver, with a puzzled expression, was leaning over the side of the engine and listening hard. "It's very strange," he said to Toad. We're the last train running in this direction tonight, yet I could be sworn that I heard another following us."
Presently the engine driver called out,
"I can see it clearly now. It's an engine coming along at a great pace. It looks as if we're being pursued."
Toad tried hard to think of something to do, with dismal want of success.
"They're gaining fast,"
cried the engine driver.
"And the engine is crowded with warders waving halberds, policemen waving truncheons, and detectives waving revolvers, all shouting, 'Stop, stop!'"
Toad fell on his knees among the coals and cried,
"Save me, kind Mr. Engine Driver. I am not the simple washerwoman I seem to be. I am a Toad, the well-known and popular Mr. Toad. I have just escaped from a loathsome dungeon, and if those fellows on that engine recapture me, it will be chains and straw and misery once more for poor, innocent Toad."
The engine driver looked down sternly.
"What were you put in prison for?"
"Nothing much," said Toad, colouring deeply. "I only borrowed a motor car while the owners were at lunch. I didn't mean to steal it."
"Really? I fear you have been indeed a wicked Toad. But you are evidently in sore distress, so I will not desert you. Cheer up, we may beat them yet. There's just one thing to do. It's your only chance, so attend carefully. Ahead is a long tunnel, and on the other side the line passes through a thick wood. Now, I will put on all the speed I can while we're running through the tunnel. When we're through, I'll brake as hard as I can, and you must jump and hide in the wood before they see you. Then I will go full speed ahead again, and they can chase me for as long as they like and as far as they like. Now, be ready to jump when I tell you." The train shot into the tunnel, and the engine roared and rattled, till they shot out at the other end and saw the wood upon either side of the line. The driver put on the brakes, and as the train slowed, he called out, "Now, jump!" Toad jumped and scrambled into the wood. Peeping out, he saw his train get up speed again and disappear. Then out of the tunnel burst the pursuing engine, her motley crew waving their weapons and shouting, "Stop! Stop!" When they were past, Toad had a hearty laugh, but he soon stopped. It was now very late and dark and cold, and he was in an unknown wood, with no money and no chance of supper, still far from home. He struck into the wood, leaving the railway as far as possible behind him. At last, cold, hungry, and tired, he sought the shelter of a hollow tree, and slept soundly till the morning. Toad was called at an early hour by bright sunlight streaming in on him. He rubbed his eyes, shook himself, and marched forth, cold but confident, hungry but hopeful. He had the world to himself, the dewy woodland, the green fields, the road itself when he reached it. The road was presently joined by a canal, which ambled along by its side. Round a bend came plodding a solitary horse, a long dripping line attached to his collar. With a swirl of water, a barge slid up alongside. Its occupant, a stout woman wearing a sunbonnet, one arm laid along the tiller. "A nice morning, ma'am," she remarked to Toad. "I dare say it is, ma'am," responded Toad politely. "To them that's not in sore trouble, like what I am. Here's my married daughter, sends off to me to come to her at once, so off I comes, fearing the worst. I've left my business to look after itself. I'm in the washing and laundering line, and I've lost all my money and lost my way, and what may be happening to my daughter? Why, I don't like to think." "Where might your daughter be living, ma'am?" "Near the river, close to a fine house called Toad Hall." "Toad Hall? Why, I'm going that way myself," replied the bargewoman. "I'll give you a lift." Toad stepped on board and sat down with great satisfaction. "So you're in the washing business, ma'am," said the bargewoman as they glided along.
"Finest business in the whole county,"
said Toad airily.
"Are you fond of washing?"
"I love it," said Toad. "Never so happy as when I've got both arms in the wash tub."
"What a bit of luck," observed the bargewoman. "A regular piece of good fortune for us both. There's a heap of things in the corner of the cabin. If you'll just take one or two and put them through the wash tub as we go along, why, it'll be a pleasure to you and a real help to me. You'll find a tub and soap and kettle on the stove, and a bucket to haul up water from the canal with."
Toad was cornered. He saw that he was too far from the bank for a flying leap, and sullenly resigned himself to his fate. "I suppose any fool can wash," he thought in desperation. He fetched tub, soap, and other necessaries from the cabin, selected a few garments, and set to. A long half-hour passed, and Toad got crosser and crosser. Nothing that he could do seemed to do the things good. His back ached, his paws were getting crinkly. He muttered under his breath, and lost the soap for the 50th time. A burst of laughter made him look round. The bargewoman was laughing till the tears ran down her cheeks.
"Pretty washerwoman you are. Never washed so much as a dishclout in your life, Harley."
Toad's temper boiled over.
"Washerwoman indeed! I am a toad, a very distinguished toad, and I will not be laughed at by a bargewoman."
The woman peered under his bonnet.
"Why, so you are! A nasty, crawly toad! And in my nice clean barge. Now that's a thing I will not have." One big arm caught Toad by a foreleg, while the other gripped him by a hind leg, and Toad found himself flying through the air. He reached the water with a loud splash, rose to the surface spluttering, and struck out for shore. At length he touched land. Then, gathering his wet skirts over his arms, he started to run after the barge, thirsting for revenge. The bargewoman was still laughing when he drew level with her. Running swiftly on, he overtook the horse, unfastened the tow rope, jumped on the horse's back, and urged it to a gallop, steering for the open country. He looked back. The barge had run aground, and the bargewoman was gesticulating wildly and shouting. The horse's gallop soon subsided into a trot, and then a walk. But Toad was content, knowing that he was moving and the barge was not. He had travelled some miles when he reached a wide common. Nearby stood a gypsy caravan, and beside it a man was sitting on a bucket smoking. The gypsy looked at him. "Want to sell that there horse of yours?" It had not occurred to Toad to turn the horse into cash. "How much might you offer me?" The gypsy looked the horse over. "Shilling a leg," he said briefly. Toad did sums on his fingers. 4 shillings. Oh, no, I couldn't think of accepting 4 shillings for this beautiful horse. "Well," said the gypsy, "I'll make it 5 shillings, and that's my final word." "Look here," said Toad. "You hand me over 6 shillings and 6pence, and I will make over to you my horse, with all the beautiful harness and trappings thrown in." The gypsy grumbled, but he counted out 6 shillings and 6pence into Toad's paw. Toad took an affectionate farewell of the horse. The gypsy gave him directions which way to go, and he set forth. The sun was shining, his clothes were dry again, he had money in his pocket, and was nearing home and friends and safety. He felt big and strong and self-confident. As he tramped along gaily, he thought of his adventures and escapes, and how, when things seemed at their worst, he had always managed to find a way out, and his pride and conceit began to swell within him. "Ho, ho!" he said to himself as he marched along with his chin in the air. "What a clever toad I am!" He got so puffed up with conceit
that he made up a song as he walked in praise of himself, and sang it at the top of his voice, though there was no one to hear it but him. It was perhaps the most conceited song that any animal ever composed. The world has held great heroes, as history books have showed, but never a name to go down to fame compared with that of Toad. The clever men at Oxford know all that there is to be knowed, but they none of them know one half as much as intelligent Mr. Toad. The animals sat in the ark and cried, their tears in torrents flowed. Who was it said, "There's land ahead"? Encouraging Mr. Toad. The army all saluted as they marched along the road. Was it the king or Kitchener? No, it was Mr. Toad. The queen and ladies in waiting sat at the window and sewed. Oh, she cried, "Look who's that handsome man!" They answered, "Mr. Toad." He sang as he walked, and got more inflated every minute. After some miles of country lanes, he reached the high road, and as he turned into it and glanced along its white length, he saw approaching him a speck that turned into a dot, and then into a blob, and then into something very familiar, and a double note of warning, only too well known, fell on his delighted ear. "This is something like," said the excited Toad. "I will hail my brothers of the wheel, and they will give me a lift." He stepped confidently out into the road to hail the motor car. Suddenly his heart turned to water, and his knees shook. The approaching car was the very one he had stolen on that fatal day when his troubles began. He sank down in a miserable heap, murmuring, "It's all up. Chains and policemen. Oh, hapless Toad." The motor car drew nearer, and he heard it stop. Two gentlemen got out, and one said, "Oh dear, it is a poor old washerwoman, fainted in the road. Let us take her to the nearest village." They tenderly lifted Toad into the front seat of the motor car, beside the driver, and proceeded on their way. When Toad knew that he was not recognized, his courage began to revive. He opened his eyes, sat up, and looked about him. "How do you feel, ma'am?" said one of the gentlemen. "Thank you, sir. I'm feeling a great deal better." Toad was almost himself again. The old cravings took possession of him, and he turned to the driver. "Please, sir, I wish you would let me try and drive the car. It looks so interesting." The driver laughed heartily, and the gentleman said, "Bravo, ma'am. I like your spirit. Oh, let her have a try. She won't do any harm." Toad eagerly scrambled into the driver's seat, took the steering wheel, listened to the instructions given him, and carefully set the car in motion. The gentleman behind applauded. "Fancy a washerwoman driving as well as that, the first time." This annoyed Toad, and he began to lose his head. He put on full speed. "Washerwoman indeed!" he shouted recklessly. "Ho-ho! I am the Toad, the motor car snatcher, the prison breaker, the entirely fearless Toad." With a cry, the whole party flung themselves on him. "Seize him! Seize the wicked animal who stole our motor car!" With a half-turn of the wheel, Toad sent the car crashing through the low hedge that ran along the roadside and into a horse pond. Toad found himself flying through the air and landed on his back in the soft grass of a meadow. He picked himself up and pelted away, his heart in his mouth. "Oh, my!" he gasped as he panted along. "Oh, what an ass I am! Oh, what a conceited ass!" On he ran desperately, scrambling through hedges, jumping ditches, pounding across fields, until suddenly
The earth failed under his feet, and splash! He found himself head over ears in deep, rapid water. In his panic, he had run straight into the river. He rose to the surface, spluttering, and saw that he was approaching a hole in the bank above his head. As the stream bore him past, he reached up with a paw and caught hold of the edge. Slowly, he drew himself out of the water till he was able to rest his elbows on the edge of the hole, puffing and panting. As he stared into the hole, something twinkled in its depths, moving towards him. A familiar face grew up around it, brown and small, with whiskers, neat ears, and silky hair. It was the water rat. The rat gripped Toad by the scruff of the neck, gave a great hoist, and the waterlogged Toad stood, safe and sound, in the hole, streaked with mud and weed. "Oh, Ratty," he cried, "I've been through such times, such trials, such sufferings, so nobly borne, and then such escapes, such disguises, so cleverly planned and carried out. Oh, I am a smart Toad, and no mistake. Just hold on till I tell you." "Toad," said the water rat gravely, "go upstairs and clean yourself, and put on some of my clothes, and try and come down looking like a gentleman. I'll have something to say to you later." Toad went quickly to the rat's dressing room, had a thorough wash and brush up, and changed his clothes. By the time he came down again, supper was on the table. While they ate, Toad told the rat all his adventures, dwelling chiefly on his own cleverness and cunning, but the more he boasted, the more silent the rat became. When Toad had talked himself to a standstill, the rat said, "Toady, don't you see what an awful ass you've been making of yourself? You've been handcuffed, imprisoned, starved, chased, terrified, insulted, and flung into the water by a woman. When are you going to be sensible and think of your friends and try and be a credit to them?" "Quite right, Ratty. I've been a conceited ass. But now I'm going to be good. We'll have our coffee, and then I'm going to stroll down to Toad Hall, get into clothes of my own, and set things going again on the old lines. I've had enough of adventures." "Stroll down to Toad Hall?" cried the rat. "Do you mean to say you haven't heard about the Stoats and the Weasels?" "The Wild Wooders?" cried Toad, trembling. "And how they've taken Toad Hall," continued the rat. Toad leaned his chin on his paws, and a large tear welled up in each of his eyes. "Ratty," he murmured, "tell me all." "When you got into trouble, it was a good deal talked about down here. The riverbankers stuck up for you, but the wild wood animals said served you right, and you were done for. You would never come back. Mole and Badger stuck out that you would come back soon, somehow. They arranged to move into Toad Hall and keep it aired and have it ready for you when you turned up. But one dark night, a band of weasels, armed to the teeth, crept silently up to the front entrance. A body of desperate ferrets possessed themselves of the backyard, while a company of skirmishing stoats occupied the conservatory. The Mole and the Badger were sitting in the smoking room, telling stories, when those bloodthirsty villains rushed in from every side. They beat them severely, those two poor, faithful creatures, and turned them out. And the Wild Wooders have been living in Toad Hall ever since, telling everybody that they've come to stay, for good." "Oh, have they?" said Toad, getting up and seizing a stick. "I'll see about that." "It's no good, Toad. They've got armed sentries posted. We can do nothing until we have seen the Mole and the Badger and heard their news, and taken their advice in this matter." Yes," said the Toad lightly.
What's become of the dear fellows? I'd forgotten all about them."
"Well may you ask," said the Rat reproachfully. "Those two devoted animals have been camping out in every sort of weather, patrolling your boundaries, scheming how to get your property back. You don't deserve such loyal friends, Toad. You don't, really."
"I'm an ungrateful beast," sobbed Toad. "To let me go out into the night and find them."
There came a heavy knock at the door, and in walked Mr. Badger, looking very tousled. He came up to Toad, shook him by the hand.
"Welcome, Toad. Alas, this is a poor homecoming."
Then he sat down to the table and helped himself to a large slice of pie. Presently there came another, lighter knock, and the Rat ushered in the Mole, very shabby, with bits of straw in his fur.
"Hooray! Here's old Toad!"
beamed the Mole, moving towards the supper table.
"Not a bite since breakfast. Oh, my!"
And he sat down and helped himself to cold beef and pickles.
"Mole, please tell us what the position is," said the Rat.
"About as bad as it can be," replied the Mole. "The Badger and I have been round and round the place, sentries posted everywhere, guns poked out at us, stones thrown at us."
"The Stoats are on guard at every point," said the Badger. "It's useless to think of attacking the place." "Then it's all over," sobbed the Toad into the sofa cushions. "I shall never see Toad Hall anymore." "Cheer up, Teddy," said the Badger. "I haven't said my last word yet. There is an underground passage that leads from the river bank right up to the middle of Toad Hall."
Toad brightened up immediately.
Well, go on, Badger. How's this passage going to help us?" "There's going to be a banquet tomorrow night, the Chief Weasel's birthday, and all the weasels will be gathered in the dining hall, eating, drinking, and laughing, suspecting nothing. That tunnel leads right up under the pantry next to the dining hall."
"We shall creep out quietly into the pantry,"
cried the Mole.
"With our pistols and swords and sticks," shouted the Rat. "And rush in upon them," said the Badger.
"And whack 'em and whack 'em and whack 'em,"
cried the Toad. "Very well," said the Badger. "Our plan is settled, so off to bed at once. We will make the arrangements tomorrow."
Toad slept till late the next morning. By the time he got down, the other animals had finished their breakfast. The Mole had slipped off by himself. The Badger was reading the paper. The Rat was busily distributing weapons in 4 little heaps. Presently the Mole came tumbling into the room.
"I've been having such fun. I've been getting a rise out of the Stoats. I put on Toad's old washerwoman dress and bonnet, and I went to Toad Hall. The sentries were on the lookout, of course. 'Good morning, gentlemen,' says I. 'Want any washing done today?' They looked at me very stiff and haughty, and the sergeant said to me, 'Run away, my good woman.' 'Run away?' says I. 'It won't be me running away a short time from now.' I could see them pricking up their ears. 100 bloodthirsty badgers armed with rifles are going to attack Toad Hall this very night by way of the paddock. 6 boatloads of rats with cutlasses will come up the river, while the death or glory toads will storm the orchard, yelling for vengeance. Clear out while you have the chance.' Then I ran away."
"Mole," said the Badger, "you have managed excellently. I begin to have great hopes of you."
After luncheon, the Badger settled into an armchair for 40 winks. The Rat resumed his preparations, and the Mole led Toad into the open air, shoved him into a wicker chair, and made him tell him all his adventures. which Toad was only too willing to do. When it began to grow dark, the Rat summoned them into the parlour and proceeded to dress them up for the expedition. For each animal there was a belt, a sword, a cutlass, pistols, a truncheon, handcuffs, bandages and sticking plaster. The Badger took a lantern in one paw, grasped his stick with the other, and said, "Now then, follow me." He led them along the river for a little, and then swung himself over the edge into a hole in the bank. The Mole, the Rat, and the Toad followed. They were in the secret passage. It was cold and dark and damp and narrow. They groped along, ears pricked and paws on their pistols, till suddenly they heard over their heads a confused murmur of sound, shouting and cheering and stamping on the floor and hammering on tables. They hurried along the passage till it came to a stop, and they were standing under a trap door. The Badger said, "Now, boys, all together!" And they put their shoulders to the trapdoor and heaved it back. Hoisting each other up, they found themselves in the pantry, with only a door between them and the banqueting hall where their enemies were carousing. The Badger took a firm grip of his stick, cried, "Follow me," and flung the door wide. What a squealing and a screeching filled the air when the four heroes strode wrathfully into the room. There were but four, but to the panic-stricken weasels the hall seemed full of monstrous animals, grey, black, brown, and yellow, whooping and flourishing enormous cudgels, and they broke and fled with squeals of terror and dismay through the windows, up the chimney, anywhere to get out of the reach of those terrible sticks. Up and down the hall strode the friends, whacking with their sticks, and in 5 minutes the room was cleared. The Badger leaned on his stick and wiped his brow. "Mole," he said, "just cut along and look after those stout sentries of yours. I've an idea that we shan't have much trouble from them." The Mole vanished through a window, and the Badger bade the other two set a table on its legs again and see if they could find materials for supper. "Stir your stumps, Toad, and look lively." Toad bustled about, and so did the Rat, and they were just about to sit down when the Mole clambered in through the window, chuckling with an armful of rifles. "It's all over. As soon as the Stoats heard the uproar inside the hall, they threw down their rifles and fled. So, that's all right." The Mole pulled his chair up to the table, and they finished their supper in great joy and contentment, and presently retired to rest, safe in Toad's ancestral home, won back by matchless valour, consummate strategy, and a proper handling of sticks.